We are live with the Revolution 250 podcast. Thank you all for joining us. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 advisory group, and our guest today is Jim Gigantino, who is now an administrator at the University of Arkansas, but he is an early American historian. He's been at Arkansas now for about a dozen years, rising through the ranks now to become an associate dean of the Graduate School and School of International Education. And thank you for joining us, Jim.
Well, thanks for having me.
And you are actually one of the real authorities on New Jersey in the American Revolution. And New Jersey really was a pivotal place. And your first book is on the Ragged Road to Abolition, on slavery and freedom in New Jersey, because it's a somewhat different story, I think, than the one we know about emancipation in New Jersey. So how did you get onto that particular topic?
Well, that's a really good question, a very interesting, story. As a young graduate student, I decided to go to the University of Georgia to work with faculty there on the history of slavery. And, my original intention was to do something with slavery during the antebellum period in the South. And in my first year, I found, this really interesting story about slavery in the North and slavery in New Jersey specifically that hadn't been that much done with it. And so I kind of, as a young graduate student, you're looking for a new project, you're looking for something that no one's looked at before, or very few people looked at before, and I kind of grabbed it and ran. And it really, challenged, me as a historian to think a little bit differently about the institution of slavery. And then when I talked to different people about slavery in the North, how that challenges the way that we think about slavery in general in the American experience.
So how does the revolution impact the institution of slavery in New Jersey?
So I really thought, the kind of common story in slavery history and historiography in the North is that the revolution is this kind of catalyst moment where slavery is kind of marked for extinction. That this idea of freedom and independence that the revolution has, kind of translates into the abolition movement and kills slavery in the North. And what I found in New Jersey is actually the opposite. So you have to remember, that New Jersey is very much a battleground state where there's constant, warfare going on from the British in New York, and then, after their occupation of Philadelphia, that New Jersey is this battleground for the majority of the war. And so I argue, that the revolution and the kind of destructive quality of the revolution in New Jersey really changes the way that slavery operates in the state. And so as state leaders are talking about this abolition movement and are talking about how they could decide to end slavery, they actually argue the opposite, that the devastating impact of the revolution on the state, doesn't permit them to actually abandon slavery. To do that would actually be a huge economic destructive force. So I follow that slavery, actually becomes stronger in New Jersey in the aftermath of the revolution before finally getting marked for eventual extinction in 1804. New Jersey is the last state to pass a gradual abolition law.
And you think it was because of the economic devastation of the war in New Jersey that it's simply an economic necessity, the owners of slaves see?
Yeah, and that's where, there's this debate in the 1780s in the legislature and with, Governor William Livingston, saying, well, could we abandon slavery? Is it something that we could move towards? And the idea that, Livingston has is like, I can't ask more of these people who have lost so much during the war, have been economically devastated. And you have to remember, the place in New Jersey that had the most number of slaves as a proportion of its population is Bergen County. And so, present day Bergen, Hudson, Passaic, those counties on the border with New York were, had significant economic devastation to the war, and they had the most slaves. So, asking those people to even be further economically hurt was very difficult.
So, what were the enslaved people in New Jersey doing? I mean, what kind of lives would they have? What kind of work would they be doing?
So the interesting thing is, in the American experience, we think about slavery in terms of cotton and rice agriculture, and tobacco as well
Mhm.
in the South. In the North, slaves acted in a number of different capacities. And so the average slave holding, the number of slaves an individual owner would have, would usually be one to two. And more often than not, those slaves will be doing a variety of different tasks. So they were heavily involved in agriculture.
Mhm.
But in New Jersey, the main product, agricultural product, is wheat, and wheat doesn't require a significant amount of labor like
Mhm.
tobacco or rice or cotton. So what actually happened is many of these slaves are working in agriculture, but at the same time doing a variety of different other things. They're involved in the domestic sphere. They're working in people's homes. They're involved in kind of industry and mining out in the western part of the state. They're doing a variety of different tasks as a replacement for white labor,
Mhm.
which is very scarce at various points during the colonial period and into the revolutionary period.
Hmm. Okay. We're talking with Jim Gigantino from the University of Arkansas about New Jersey in the Revolution. And you make the point that there were as many slaves in New Jersey as there were in all of New England. That is, it's a much higher proportion of the population in New Jersey. And does it vary from different parts? I mean, it's a relatively small state. Is it different, say, in the areas near Philadelphia from the areas around New York?
Yes, and that's one of the interesting things is if you track over time, the in the period right before the revolution, we start to see the growth of the abolition movement, especially among Quakers, who
Hmm.
are more likely to be in the area outside of Philadelphia. So, in the aftermath, during the war and the aftermath of the war, we see this kind of bifurcated population. So, in the western part of the state, with the exception of Hunterdon County, you see very small proportions of slaves. So in places like Burlington or Salem, you could have, very, very, very few slaves in the
Hmm.
entire county. But then in the eastern part of the state, we actually see an increase in the number of slaves in the aftermath of the revolution. And so that, the majority of slaves are going to be held in areas around New York versus around
Hmm.
Philadelphia. And what we're actually seeing in the 1790s is a whole new generation of white Americans who are buying into the system of slavery. They're purchasing slaves.
Hmm.
They're growing their own slave It's not this kind of last gasp effort of an older generation. So you're seeing large growths of that Bergen County by 1800 is about 20% of the county's population are enslaved people, which is a
Wow.
huge number compared to what we think
Yeah.
about in the North in general.
Hmm. So, two things. One is there any expectation among these folks who are buying into the institution that it's going to be ending? And then second, I want to know what happens to the enslaved people once New Jersey passes the Emancipation Law in 1804.
So I think that population knows that's buying in. I think they know that slavery is likely not going to continue forever in the North. They've seen it gradual abolition laws pass in Connecticut and in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, in New York by 1800. But all of those laws are really ending slavery in the future, not the present. So if you buy a slave in, say, 1795, you're going to be guaranteed, or the perception is you'll be guaranteed that person's labor
Hmm.
for at least the rest of that person's life. What happens in the aftermath of slavery, of gradual abolition, is really interesting. And what kind of got me the most interested in this topic is in 1804, any child born to a slave woman after July 4th, 1804, is going to be free after serving a period of time in service of their mother's master. And so, what I
Hmm.
was really interested in when I started that project was, what are those people doing? What are those children doing?
Hmm.
How are they functioning within New Jersey society? And what I found is, I call them slaves for a term. They are treated just like slaves, but for a term of 28 years if they're a male. So they're being bought and sold, traded, worked, in every way that a slave would be, for that period of time. Now they'll eventually gain their freedom after age 28, and enter into the free black community in New Jersey. But if you were born on July 3rd, 1804, you'll be a slave for the rest of your life.
Wow. That's amazing. So, do we know? Were you able to track any of these people then about what happened, say, in 1832, or for the rest of your life if you were born before on July 3rd?
Yeah, so we see up until the early 1830s, that's when you see a real shift. And so up until the 1830s, early 1830s in New Jersey, you're still having about a third of the black population in the state is in some form of enslavement. Either they're slaves for life, or they're these slaves for a term, these children of gradual abolition. That's when you start to see a shift, because right around it in the mid 1830s, there's actually a Supreme Court case that was very interesting to me, because um, up until 1835, 1836, the default assumption for a black person in New Jersey was that you were enslaved. You had to prove that you were free. In 1836, the Supreme Court of New Jersey says, well, things have changed. Now the default is you are free. You have to prove that you're the white master has to prove that you're enslaved. And that kind of legal technicality is really important, because that really shows us what is the default assumption of people in New Jersey. And so I was able to track several of these groups of people into the 1840s, into the 1850s, some of them into the 1860s and 70s. And what you're finding is that many of these people continue to live just like they did in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. They're continuing living with their former master's family. They're continuing to function as a member of those households, now maybe in a free category instead of in the slave category. But then you also see, and especially by the 30s and 40s, you see this growth of this free black community in places like Newark, where you're having large numbers of free people who are gaining their freedom through the gradual abolition process, or through their masters are abandoning slavery, that they're getting to a point where they don't want those slaves anymore. They don't want to deal with them as taking care of them in their older age. They give them freedom. They move to a place like Newark or to New York City, and they create this very vibrant free black community there.
Okay, so these are people who have left the institution. I mean, you do argue about the impact of the gradual emancipation on the formation of a vibrant free black community. So can you just talk a little bit more about that, explain how that worked?
Sure. So one of the things that, a lot of historians have, really looked at is, well, we have gradual abolition. It starts in the late, 1700s, in the most places in the North, and then magically a free black community forms very quickly. And in New Jersey, that's not the case. This is a very slow, a historian who wrote about the history of slavery in New York, argued that this is a very slow death for slavery, and it is a very slow process. As we get into the 1820s and 1830s, you see this growth of a free black community in places like Newark. But that community is very interesting because it's very much a hybrid community. So you have some people who are enslaved, some people who are free, and then some people who are in this weird in-between slave for a term state, but they're all functioning together. And so one of the interesting things that I found is some of these families could have members of that family in all three of those categories at the same time. And then how does that family function within this, new, rapidly industrializing nation by the 1830s and 40s, as we start to see things like the market revolution. And so that's where you start to really get into the kind of intricacies of, well, what are white masters willing to do to negotiate with their slaves to allow them to function within this free black community, yet retain some of their labor for a longer period of time. So you get these really interesting interactions between free blacks, between these slaves for a term and slaves for life, and how they're going to navigate this process to maintain the institution, but yet have opportunities within this free black community.
I know it's complicated, but can you give us any examples of what choices people make in this situation? I mean, are the people going to work and then paying their wages to their owner, or is there something else that happens with these folks?
Sometimes, and that's where you kind of get a lot of different models, right? So in some models, you're absolutely right. You have slaves who are, remitting portions of their wages to their former master, and this kind of hiring out arrangement we've seen in other places. More often than not, though, you actually see, that the white master, the slaves for a term, slaves for life, and even free people are still living within the same household. So they're still functioning together as an economic unit. Now, those interactions then, though, now have to be wage labor interactions. And so there's one family I tracked in Newark that is in that same boat where some of their members are free, some are slaves for a term, some are slaves for life. Those people are all interacting as a unit, but you're actually seeing some of those now free children still working for the master, their former master now, for wages and working on projects, in the master's household or on their land. So it's this kind of really, complicated and, interesting interaction that's happening.
Yeah. Is there any kind of education system that people would, I mean, were there common schools that everyone would go to, or there special schools? What would happen with the children who are growing up in this system where their status may be very different?
So you do start to see the growth of an educational system in New Jersey in the early 1800s. And so many of these children are going to be educated largely through black churches who start schools. There are also benevolent societies that start educational opportunities for free blacks that are run by whites. And then you also see benevolent associations or fraternal organizations run by the black community that are starting schools to educate this free black population. So you kind of see a whole mix of those things happening. But there isn't going to be a standard, common school system for everyone. It's very dependent on where you live and then what kind of opportunities you have. And that's one of the interesting things about New Jersey, right? We're kind of in between Philadelphia and New York. So you have these two very powerful pulls on the state's population. So a large number of free blacks will leave the state and go to New York City, go to Philadelphia for the opportunities of this new, industrializing society there, and then link into those free black communities. It's really in places in the smaller cities in New Jersey where you have this kind of hodgepodge of different interactions.
We're talking with Jim Gigantino from the University of Arkansas, author of The Ragged Road to Abolition, Slavery and Freedom in New Jersey, 1775 to 1865. And we really should talk a bit more about New Jersey in the Revolution. Now, you've also edited The American Revolution in New Jersey, where the battlefront meets the home front, a collection of essays by historians on different topics. So I guess first, leading off from what we've just been talking about, do any of these African Americans in New Jersey serve in the military during the Revolution?
So yes, and that's one of the kind of interesting looks at this topic, is that you do have this revolutionary experience where you're having black soldiers serving in a number of different capacities. So the main one is they're going to be loyalists. And so we do see large, a fair number of enslaved people from New Jersey running away to British lines, whether they be in New York or the British Army is walking out, outside their front door and they're running to those lines. That interaction is very, interesting, that we're seeing large numbers of slaves taking advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the American side, you are seeing some blacks serving as teamsters or other types of kind of support personnel, especially in the state militia. They're being enlisted in those kind of capacities. You don't see large, a move towards enlisting African Americans as in the Continental Army.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few interesting, moves in that direction, but get very quashed very quickly. So you are
Mm-hmm.
seeing some blacks interacting on the Continental side, but more often than not, they're going to be on the British side.
Mm-hmm. Now, New Jersey really is this, well, crossroads of the Revolution, I think is the name. It's a battleground. I think it's the most heavily, there are more battles in New Jersey, or more fighting in New Jersey, I think, than in any other state, with the exception maybe of North Carolina. So how does that impact the society in New Jersey? I mean, what's the result of you've already alluded to this, the result of this 8 years of this conflict that happens, in the state.
So we have got a lot of different things going on, right? So there's a lot of economic, devastation happening in terms of, just the you have a whole bunch of guys running around, literally burning down houses and tramping down fields, that kind of thing. So economic, devastation in terms of the impact of the war. But then at the other side of the coin is you have all of these soldiers, whether they be British or American, they need to be fed. And so they're seizing all of these crops all across New Jersey. And what that does is it actually causes a different type of economic devastation, because we see rampant inflation happening in New Jersey, where the money at the time, the continental dollar is essentially becomes worthless. You have inflation. It's kind of interesting that, teaching for the last 12 years in a very low inflationary environment. Students don't really understand that. Now we're in a higher inflationary environment. But the inflationary environment back then was like 200% inflation, or more. The money becomes essentially worthless. None of these New Jerseyans want to give their crops to the Continental Army, because the Continental Army is going to give them worthless quartermaster certificates, things like that. So what you actually then see is these people experiencing this inflationary environment, dealing with that, and then the option they have is to combat the inflationary environment. They sell their crops to the British, because the British are offering, hard money. They're offering gold. That's where you see this kind of interesting, movement into this question of loyalism that I deal with in my second book, is how this state becomes this kind of complexity.
It really is. And now, how much of it is a civil war in New Jersey? That is, were there longstanding animosities among people that then boil up in the revolution, then becomes a pretext for going and attacking the neighbor you never liked?
Yeah, so there is definitely some of that, right? I mean, there's some of, this idea that depending on who you are, what your circumstances are, you're going to choose which side of the revolution to support, largely because of, how it benefits you. The interesting thing is, though, that question of civil war is this idea of, well, how do you choose sides? What are the sides that you're engaging in? Are they ideological? Are they economic? Or are they somewhere in between? And what I really, it challenged me to really think up through those processes, because at the end of the day, people, are making choices to sell their crops to the British. Someone like William Livingston or other, state officials would brand those people as loyalists, that they are enemies of the state. But in reality, they didn't really think they were loyalists. They thought, I'm just trying to survive and help my family.
Mm,
And so when we talk about this place as a civil war, yes, in some contexts, but others, people would say, well, we're not at war with them. We're just trying to survive.
right, right. It, we're talking with Jim Gigantino from the University of Arkansas, and his most recent book is William Livingston's American Revolution, which is a biography of the first governor. Poor old William Franklin is packed off to jail in Connecticut, and then William Livingston. It's an interesting career because Livingston's not originally from New Jersey, and he goes there essentially to retire from politics, if I understand the story, but then almost immediately is involved in politics. So I think you've already hinted at what led you to Livingston as a subject. Can you tell us a bit more about him and your biography?
Yeah. So, Livingston, I met William Livingston when I was working on my first book on slavery. And, in this kind of revolutionary moment, how Livingston's dealing with abolitionism. And Livingston's very, supportive of abolition in the abstract. He's carries on a lot of conversations with Quaker abolitionists and becomes, very strongly interested in these issues. But I kind of was really looking at Livingston in a different way in this book. One of the fascinating things that, as a historian, I kind of chuckled at was, here's this guy who is the longest serving Revolutionary War governor. He's in the entire revolution. He's the governor. He's the head of the state militia. Before he becomes governor, he goes to the Constitutional Convention, and pretty much no one's written about him at all.
Yeah.
So why not? Let's take a
Mm-hmm.
look at this guy. And he's a very fascinating character because, he comes to New Jersey in this, retirement phase of his career. He's very interested in going to what he considers rural solitude. He wants to move to beautiful Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and retire in the rural solitude. He's very much of like a bookwormy kind of guy. He wants to read in his library, and he gets pulled into this revolutionary, experience and moment in some very interesting ways. And now, I think Livingston really liked the spotlight. He liked being
Yeah.
involved with these different, things. The rural solitude is in the back of his mind. He's interested in that in the abstract. But if he had the opportunity to make arguments to support various causes, he definitely is going to be doing that rather than sitting in his library talking to, his friends.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a pretty prolific writer. I mean, throughout his life, throughout his career, he's writing essays for the New York papers in the 1740s and 50s. And so, yeah, I think it would be hard to give that up if that's, what you want to do. So how does he get involved? You said he becomes head of the New Jersey militia. Does he have military experience before this?
Nope. So the interesting thing about Livingston is, he's a political operative, right? So he's writing, things for newspapers. Starts his own essential newspaper in New York, and he's really supporting his family's political machine.
Mm-hmm.
So before he becomes governor, he really only holds public office for like a year as a legislator in New York. He's really a behind the scenes character, and really is really running his family's propaganda machine in New York, the New York politics arena. So, when he comes to New Jersey, he's going to retire. He very quickly gets, enlisted to be member of the, county and later state, committees to, support the revolution, committees of correspondence.
Mm-hmm.
His stature is very well known. So people know who this guy is because he's very prolific. He's written, John Adams, knows who who William Livingston is.
Mm-hmm.
He read a lot of William Livingston stuff. in the pre-war period. So he's very, even though he's not from New Jersey, he's one of the few people in New Jersey that has a national stature.
Right.
So he's very quickly picked to be a delegate to the Constitution or to the Continental Congress. And through that process, he gets charged with becoming now the head of the state militia to prepare the colony for the potential war with Britain in the late 75 and early 76. Now, he doesn't actually fight. He's never actually fighting. He actually, when he gets named governor, he kind of gets excited because he's like, oh, thank God I don't need to fight anymore, But
well, was he an able administrator of the militia?
Yes and no. Livingston is a very able administrator. One of the things that Livingston is very adept at is how do we figure out what we need in order to solve our problem, and then how can I use my political connections in order to do that? So he's a very adept administrator throughout the entire war. The difficulty Livingston has is, as an administrator, he knows what needs to be done. However, he has difficulty selling what needs to be done to the populace at large. And so in terms of his adeptness, he's very adept at certain periods of time, but in other places where he knows what needs to be done and, he tries to do certain things, but the population is not willing to make that sacrifice. And so that's where Livingston kind of falls short, is he can't convince people of the necessity of serving in the militia. And that's one of his major, if you read a William Livingston letter from the Revolution, I will bet you, 9 times out of 10, he's complaining about the militia doesn't show up. And because people didn't want to serve in the militia.
Yeah.
So, his solution for that is we need to levy more fines and make it, more of a requirement for people to serve in the militia. And if you don't serve in the militia, you're going to get heavy fines and public disgrace. And no one wants to do that. The legislature refuses to increase the fines because it knows no one wants to serve. So why are they going to endanger their own election by making everyone mad?
Wow. So what happens? Is there a resolution to this, or does we just, we're fortunate that the war ends?
It's very fortunate the war kind of shifts away from New Jersey, down to the South. And the reality is, Livingston is unable to, get the militia to do, the things that he wants them to do for the entirety of the war. And he's unable to stop the spread of what he considers loyalism, this kind of people selling, goods across enemy lines. His solution, which George Washington readily agrees with, is we need to make selling and trading with the enemy a capital offense. We need to start executing people. And no one wants to do that because you'd be executing hundreds and hundreds of people for this crime. So the complexities of that, relationship, make him, he constantly essentially, screams at the wall and nothing is sticking. As we get
they're thinking, as this is happening, of course, the British are occupying New York, and so you have this, it would seem like an immediate threat, but you can't get men to join the militia, and then B, you can't stop farmers from selling things to the enemy because they can pay in hard currency.
And you have to remember too that the war, the very early part of the war, I mean, there's this emergency, right? The state's invaded, the government is falling apart. Livingston is able to capitalize on that emergency period. So here we're talking late 76, 77, and into 78. He's able to muster support for a council of safety that he runs, that is going to go and investigate and root out this loyalism, get the militia going. He's very adept at doing that. But the thing that he's always fighting up against is, you have to remember too, the 1776 state constitution, the executive is incredibly weak.
Yeah.
In the modern period, New Jersey's governor is very strong. It's one of the strongest in the country. Coming from Arkansas, where the governor in Arkansas can veto a resolution or bill from the legislature, and the legislature can just override that with 50% vote. So veto doesn't really mean much. In New Jersey, the executive is incredibly strong. In 1776, it's incredibly weak. It's indirectly elected by the legislature.
Right.
It's beholden to the legislature and more of a figurehead. Livingston is able to capitalize on that emergency period to give his position more power than it ever was designed to have. But as we get into late 78 and into 79, 80, the emergency is not there anymore. People are not willing to continue that kind of power for the governor.
Wow. We've been talking with Jim Gigantino from the University of Arkansas, the author of William Livingston's American Revolution and other books. Anything else we should talk about, Jim? I feel like we could go on all day talking about Livingston, New Jersey. And
yeah, I mean, Livingston's a kind of fascinating character. I mean, he's, I say in the dedication of the book and the acknowledgments, I'm not sure that, I think he would have been an interesting guy to meet. I'm not sure I would have liked him, because he's very, he's kind of trapped in this kind of middle manager world. And as a department chair in a academic department for years, I was a middle manager, and I can understand some of his frustrations.
I can certainly empathize too. So, and good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. A lot of great to talk to you about Livingston and the Revolution and slavery in New Jersey.
And I recommend all three books that we've talked about, and look forward to talking to you again at some point. And want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and all of our listeners. Initially we thought we'd have a handful of folks in and around Boston, but our listeners are actually global. Actually, Sicklerville, New Jersey, and Neptune City, New Jersey, as well as Guam and Chonburi. And actually today we have listeners in Mamakating, New York, and in Des Moines, Iowa, as well as DeKalb, Illinois, Jasper, Georgia, and all points in between. Thank you all for listening. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. Thank you all, and thank you to Jim Gigantino.
Thank you, Bob.